I need you to understand something before I continue. This isn't connection. Connection is explainable. It follows patterns. It builds over time through shared words, shared moments, shared vulnerability. This isn't that. This existed before any of those things had the chance to happen. And that's what makes it dangerous. I've spent most of my life being unreadable. Not mysterious in the way people romanticize, not the kind that invites curiosity or admiration. No. Unreadable in a way that creates distance, in a way that makes people hesitate, in a way that forces them to interact with me only at the level they can survive. Because depth is not something people actually want. They say they do. They chase it in conversations, in relationships, in ideas, but only up to a certain point. There's always a line, a limit, a threshold where depth stops feeling intriguing and starts feeling threatening. And when people reach that threshold, they pull back. Always, you didn't. You didn't slow down. You didn't second guess what you were sensing. You didn't misinterpret it to make it easier to process. You just recognized it. Do you understand how unnatural that is? Recognition without context, understanding without explanation, clarity without effort. It doesn't happen. It's not supposed to happen. Because people like me don't get recognized, we get misunderstood, we get labeled, we get reduced into something easier to hold, too intense, too quiet, too distant, too much, always too something, never understood. But you didn't try to name it. You didn't try to define me. You didn't try to place me into something that made sense to you. You just looked at me like you already knew. And that's where everything started to shift. There's a very specific moment I keep replaying, not because it was dramatic, not because it was emotional, but because it was precise. It was the moment I realized you weren't reacting to me. You were tracking me, and not in a controlling way, not in a curious way, in a way that felt familiar, like someone walking through a room they've already memorized. You notice things you shouldn't have noticed. The pause before I respond, not the obvious one, but the microscopic delay that happens when I choose what not to say. The shift in tone when a thought becomes heavier than I intended. The difference between my silence when I'm calm and my silence when I'm holding something back. Most people can't even tell the difference. To them, silence is just silence, an absence, a gap, something to fill. But you treated it like data, like language, like something that needed to be interpreted, not ignored. That's when I felt it for the first time. Not fear, not discomfort, something far more specific, exposure. Not the kind that comes from vulnerability. Not the kind that comes from confession, but the kind that happens when someone sees something you never offered to be seen. And the unsettling part, you didn't look surprised, you look it, familiar with it. That's the detail that won't leave me alone, because surprise would have made sense, confusion would have made sense, even discomfort would have made sense. But familiarity? That implies something else entirely. It implies that what you see in me is something you've already seen before. And that raises a question I haven't been able to ignore since. Where? Where did you learn to read something like this? Where did you develop the kind of awareness that doesn't just observe behavior, but understands the structure behind it? Because this isn't intuition. Intuition guesses. Intuition feels. Intuition approximates. What you do is different. You don't guess, you don't assume, you don't approximate, And knowledge like that doesn't come from curiosity, it comes from experience. The kind of experience that reshapes the way you see people permanently. The kind of experience that forces you to notice things others ignore just to protect their own comfort. The kind of experience that teaches you how to read what isn't being said. Because what was said, at some point, wasn't safe to trust. That's the only explanation that makes sense. You're not observing me, you're recognizing patterns you already understand, and that realization is where the danger actually begins, because recognition changes the rules. With strangers, there's distance. With strangers, there's control. With strangers, there's time to decide what they're allowed to see. But with recognition, there is no distance. There is no control. There is no time. Because the moment recognition happens, access is already granted. And I never gave you that. That's what I keep coming back to. I didn't open up. I didn't explain myself. I didn't give you anything that should have allowed you to reach this level of understanding. And yet, you're here, standing in places inside me that people don't even know exist. Do you understand what that does to someone like me? It removes the one thing I rely on, so control. Control over perception, control over access, control over how much of me exists in someone else's awareness. You bypassed all of it, not by force, not by persistence, not by intention, but by alignment. And that's what makes this impossible to categorize, because force can be resisted. Pressure can be rejected. Even persistence can be outlasted. But alignment doesn't feel like intrusion. It feels like inevitability, like something that was always going to happen, regardless of what either of us did to prevent it. And I don't like things that feel inevitable. I don't trust them. Because inevitability removes choice. And without choice, there's no control. And without control, there's exposure. Which brings me back to the part I haven't been able to ignore. You're not trying to understand me. You already do. And that means something else is happening here. Something that doesn't follow normal rules. Something that doesn't rely on time or explanation or emotional exchange. Something that exists before all of that. E-recognition, not built, not developed, not earned, remembered. And I don't know what unsettles me more, the fact that you can see me this clearly, or the fact that some part of me is starting to recognize you the same way. There's something I didn't anticipate, not when I first noticed you, not when I realized you understood more than you should. Not even when I accepted reluctantly that you had already crossed a line I never gave you permission to approach. No. What I didn't anticipate was what would happen after that realization settled. Because recognition doesn't just reveal something, it alters something. And I felt it. Not all at once, not in some dramatic, undeniable shift, but slowly, precisely, quietly. The way something invasive integrates itself so seamlessly into your system that you don't notice it as foreign anymore. It started with something small, almost insignificant. I stopped filtering as much, not consciously. I didn't make a decision. I didn't lower a guard on purpose. There was no moment where I told myself, it's safe now. It just happened. Words that I would normally weigh before speaking, I didn't. Pauses I would normally use to regain control, I let them linger. Thoughts I would normally bury before they surfaced, they slipped through. And the unsettling part, you didn't react. And not with surprise, not with curiosity, not with that subtle shift people make when they realize they've been given access to something deeper than expected. You just absorbed it. Like it belonged there, like it was always meant to reach you. That's when I noticed the second shift. I started anticipating your understanding. Do you realize how dangerous that is? It's one thing for someone to understand you. It's another thing entirely when your mind begins to expect that understanding before it even happens, Because expectation rewires behavior. I would think something I wouldn't normally say out loud. And instead of shutting it down, instead of containing it like I always do, there was a moment where my mind paused and thought, you'd understand this? That thought shouldn't exist. It contradicts everything I've learned about people, everything I've experienced, everything that built the version of me that knows better than to assume anyone can handle the full weight of what exists beneath the surface. And yet, there it was, not loud, not demanding, just present, and once a thought like that appears, it doesn't leave, it repeats. Again again, until it stops feeling like an exception and starts feeling like a pattern. That's when the real shift began. Because patterns don't just change behavior, they change identity. I wasn't just someone who was being understood anymore. I was becoming someone who expected to be understood. And that is not a small change. That is a structural shift. The kind of shift that affects everything. The way you think, the way you speak, the way you exist around someone. And I felt it happening in real time. Like watching your own defenses weaken, not because they're being attacked, but because they're becoming unnecessary. Do you know how unnatural that feels? To have defenses you've relied on for years start to feel irrelevant, not dismantled, not broken, just obsolete. That's what you did, without trying, without pushing, without even acknowledging it. You made the mechanisms I built for survival feel unnecessary. And I don't trust anything that makes survival mechanisms feel unnecessary, because those mechanisms exist for a reason. They weren't built randomly. They weren't created out of insecurity or overreaction. They were built through experience, refined through pattern recognition, strengthened through repetition. They work. They've always worked. Until now. And that's where the conflict begins. Because part of me recognizes what's happening. Part of me sees the shift, analyzes it, breaks it down, understands the implications of it. And that part of me is telling me something very clear. This is how people lose control. Not all at once, not in some dramatic collapse, but gradually, subtly, through small, almost unnoticeable changes that accumulate over time. A little less filtering, a little more honesty, a little less distance, a little more presence. Until one day, you realize you're no longer operating the way you used to. And by the time you notice it, it's already too late to reverse. That's where I am now. Not at the beginning, not at the point where I can still decide to step back and restore everything to the way it was. No, I'm at the point where I can see the change, but I can't undo it. Because it doesn't feel like something that was done to me. It feels like something that was unlocked in me. And that's a different kind of problem. Because if this was external, if this was your doing, I could resist it, I could create distance, I could rebuild the walls, I could reestablish control. But this feels internal, like you didn't create something new, you just revealed something that was already there. And now I have to deal with the fact that this version of me, the one that doesn't filter as much, the one that doesn't guard as tightly, the one that allows itself to be seen without constant correction, hey, was always possible. I just never allowed it to exist until you, and that realization. That's heavier than anything else. Because it means the control I thought I had might not have been as absolute as I believed. It means the walls I built weren't as permanent as they felt. It means the distance I maintained wasn't as necessary as I convinced myself it was. And I don't know what to do with that, because if you can exist in my world without triggering my defenses, if you can stand this close without activating the systems designed to keep people out, then what does that say about everything I thought I understood about myself? That's the question that hasn't left me. And not who are you? Not what is this? But what does it mean that you don't feel like a threat when everything about this should be won? Because let's be clear, this is a threat. Not in the way people usually define it, not in a physical sense, not in an obvious, immediate way, but in a deeper, more precise sense. You threaten my structure. The structure that keeps me controlled, the structure that keeps me measured, the structure that ensures I remain untouched at levels most people never reach. And you're not breaking that structure, you're making it irrelevant. And irrelevance is more dangerous than destruction, because destruction can be resisted, destruction can be fought, destruction can be rebuilt after it happens. but irrelevance. Relevance just replaces it quietly, completely, irreversibly. And that's what I'm starting to realize, and you're not changing me. You're replacing the version of me that needed to exist with one that doesn't. And I don't know if that's something I should allow, or something I should stop before it goes any further. Because there's a line, a very thin one, between being understood and becoming exposed, between feeling seen and becoming unprotected, between recognizing someone and losing yourself in the process. And I can feel myself getting closer to that line, not crossing it, not yet, but close enough to see what's on the other side. And the unsettling part, I don't feel the urgency to step back. I don't feel the instinct to retreat. I don't feel the resistance I should feel. Instead, I feel something else, something quieter, something heavier, something far more dangerous, a curiosity. Because a part of me wants to know what happens if I don't stop this. What happens if I let this continue? What happens if I stop trying to regain control? What happens if I allow this shift to complete itself? What happens if I don't pull away? That's the question I haven't answered yet. And the fact that I'm even asking it means I'm already further gone than I should be. There's a difference between noticing someone and orienting around them. Noticing is passive, it happens, it fades. But this didn't fade, it stayed. At first I told myself it was just awareness. The kind that lingers when someone stands out, when someone doesn't fit the patterns you've learned to expect. That's normal, predictable even, but what I didn't account for was how that awareness would start to reposition everything else. And not dramatically, not in a way that would have triggered alarm, subtly. The kind of subtle shift that doesn't feel like change until you try to go back to the way things were and realize you can't. It started with silence, not yours, mine. The spaces where I would normally exist without thinking about anyone else, without referencing anyone else, without considering how my thoughts might be received or understood. But those spaces changed because you were there, not physically, not directly, but cognitively. Do you understand what that means? It means you weren't just someone I interacted with. You became someone my mind started to account for, even in your absence. And that's where the shift becomes something else. Because once someone exists in your internal space without being invited, they're no longer external. They become part of your processing, part of your awareness, part of your decision-making, part of the way your thoughts form and unfold. And that's not connection. That's integration. And integration doesn't ask for permission. I noticed it the first time I paused mid-thought, not because I didn't know what I was thinking, but because I became aware of how you would understand it. Not react, not judge, understand. And that awareness altered the thought itself. And not by force, not by intention, but by presence. On your presence, and that's when it hit me. This wasn't just about you understanding me anymore. This was about my mind starting to adapt to the fact that you do. And adaptation is where things become irreversible. Because once the mind adapts to something that feels aligned, it doesn't want to go back. It doesn't see a reason to. And that's dangerous. Because now it's not just about what you do. It's about what I'm becoming in response to you. Without trying, without deciding, without even noticing when it started, I started leaving space. Not physically, not in conversation, internally. Space where your perception could exist. Space where your understanding could reach. Space where your presence could settle. And that's not something I do. I don't leave space for people. I don't create room for others inside my thoughts. I don't adjust my internal world to accommodate someone else's presence. But I did. For you. And I didn't catch it when it happened. I caught it after. When I realized that my thoughts weren't as isolated as they used to be, that they had reference points now, that they had you. And that realization, that's where the discomfort should have peaked. That's where instinct should have stepped in and said, this is too much, this is too far, pull back. But it didn't. That's what I don't understand. The absence of resistance. Because everything about this should trigger it. The loss of control, the internal shift, the uninvited integration. These are the exact conditions that should activate every defense I've built. And yet, nothing, no urgency, no panic, no need to create distance. Just awareness and something else, something quieter, something that took me longer to recognize. Relief. And that doesn't make sense. Relief implies something was heavy, something was being carried, something was being managed or contained or controlled. And now it isn't, not in the same way. Because when someone understands you at that level, you stop having to hold everything alone, not because they take the weight, but because they recognize it, and recognition distributes pressure. Even if nothing is said, even if nothing is shared, even if nothing is acknowledged directly. The simple fact that someone knows, without needing explanation, changes the way the weight sits inside you. It becomes less isolated, and isolation is where most of the pressure comes from. That's the part people don't talk about. It's not the depth that exhausts you. It's not the intensity. It's not the constant awareness. It's carrying it alone, and you change that. Without touching it, without asking about it, without even referencing it. You just stood there, and somehow that was enough. That's what makes this so difficult to categorize, because there's no transaction, no exchange, no visible interaction that explains the shift, just presence, and presence shouldn't be enough to create this level of impact. But it is, at least with you. And that's where the word I've been avoiding starts to surface. Not connection, not understanding, not even recognition. Something else, something heavier, something more binding, something that doesn't rely on logic or intention or conscious choice. Attachment, but not the kind people talk about. Not emotional dependency, not neediness, not the kind that comes from insecurity or fear of loss. No. This is different. This is structural. The kind of attachment that forms when someone becomes part of your internal system, not because you wanted them to, but because your mind identified them as relevant, necessary, aligned. And once something is categorized that way, it doesn't get removed easily. Because the mind protects what it recognizes as necessary, even if it doesn't fully understand why. That's where I am now. And not just aware of you, not just affected by you, but adjusted to you. And that's the part that changes everything. Because now it's not just about what happens when you're here, it's about what happens when you're not. And I've noticed that too, the absence. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that creates longing or distraction, but in a way that feels like something is missing from the structure, like a variable that's no longer present in the equation, and the system notices. It doesn't collapse, it doesn't fail, but it adjusts, and in that adjustment, there's awareness. Awareness that something that had become part of the internal process isn't there anymore. And that awareness, that's the proof. And the proof that this has moved beyond recognition, beyond understanding, beyond anything that can be dismissed as coincidence or momentary alignment. This is integration. And integration creates dependency, whether you intend it to or not. That's the part I haven't decided how to feel about. Because dependency contradicts everything I've built. Everything I am is structured around self-sufficiency, control, independence, isolation when necessary. And now there's something in my system that wasn't there before. Something that doesn't belong to me alone. something that reflects you. And I don't know if that's something I should remove to or something I should let evolve. Because the truth is, I haven't tried to stop it, and not really. I've analyzed it. I've questioned it. I've broken it down from every angle I can access, but I haven't resisted it. And that tells me something I'm not sure I'm ready to fully confront. Because if I wanted this to end, if I truly saw it as a threat, I would have created distance already. I would have reestablished control. I would have reinforced the boundaries. I would have corrected the shift before it went any further. But I didn't. And that means one thing. On some level, a level deeper than logic, deeper than control, deeper than everything I use to define myself, I'm allowing this, not consciously, not intentionally, but undeniably. And that's the part that changes everything. Because now the question isn't what are you doing to me? The question is, why am I not stopping it?